5 years ago, I relocated to South Dakota. It was my first experience living independently, a transition that, in hindsight, was long overdue. My parents had been nagging me for years to leave home, and I finally relented. Being somewhat of a recluse, the prospect of an isolated dwelling held significant appeal. The house I discovered was situated in a particularly snowy region of the state, nestled on a property where the nearest neighbor was a considerable distance away, a fact that suited me perfectly. For the most part, my expectations were met. The initial few years passed uneventfully, in the best sense of the word. I maintained a quiet routine. I went to work, returned home, and generally kept to myself. I never introduced myself to any of my neighbors, partly due to my reserved nature, and partly because there was no compelling reason to do so. The homes in that area are so widely dispersed that weeks could go by without encountering another person. Everything changed one afternoon in early February. I was at work when the snow began to fall. Initially, it seemed unremarkable, but within an hour, it had intensified dramatically. The wind picked up, visibility plummeted to almost zero, and the roads became increasingly hazardous. Eventually, my boss advised everyone to head home before conditions worsened further. Driving a lifted truck, I wasn't overly concerned about the journey back. I'd navigated through numerous severe weather events before, and my truck had always performed reliably. Nevertheless, certain sections of the drive gave me pause. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, I was immensely relieved to be home. However, as I attempted to unlock my front door, I discovered it was frozen solid. I paused for a moment to process the situation, then tried again, but it wouldn't budge. I had no lighter or anything else capable of generating sufficient heat to thaw the mechanism. I tried breathing on it, cupping my hands around it, and even banging on it a few times out of sheer frustration. Nothing worked. I walked back to my truck and sat there, unsure of my next move. The heater was blasting, and I told myself I would simply wait out the storm. Perhaps it would subside in an hour or two, and I could then figure something out. But as I watched through the windshield, the snow only seemed to fall harder. After about 10 minutes, I realized I was making a mistake. The longer I waited, the worse things would become. My truck was already half buried, and despite its lift, I doubted I'd be able to maneuver it out of the driveway. So, driving was no longer an option. I had no one to call. I didn't know any of my neighbors, and my parents lived hours away. I tried to drive the truck out, but, as I suspected, it was stuck. My only real choice was to walk to one of the neighboring houses and ask for assistance. I dreaded the idea of appearing at a stranger's door, asking for shelter. But I had no other alternative. Spending the entire night in my truck was not feasible. The gas would eventually run out, leaving me trapped in a freezing metal box in the middle of a blizzard. The nearest house was still quite a distance away, probably about a quarter mile. By the time I reached it, I was shivering uncontrollably. It was a tiny, single-story house, and even through the blowing snow, I could discern its dilapidated condition. I knocked on the front door as loudly as I could. I waited for a full minute and was just about to turn away and try the next house when the door swung open so violently that I instinctively recoiled. The man standing there appeared to be around 50 years old, with an unremarkable face. He looked at me for a second without speaking, then introduced himself as Joe. I explained my predicament, and he nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. I should have felt relieved, but something about him felt off from the very beginning. It was difficult to pinpoint at first. The house was warm, which was my primary concern at that moment. He offered me a seat on the couch and sat opposite me in a worn armchair. We engaged in small talk for a few minutes, or at least I attempted to. He answered my questions, but his attention seemed to be elsewhere entirely. His eyes kept darting around the room, from me to the floor, to the ceiling, to somewhere over his shoulder. It was as if he couldn't concentrate on any one thing for more than a few seconds. Initially, I thought perhaps he was simply nervous about having a stranger in his house. That would have been understandable, but the longer we sat there, the more unsettled I became. He couldn't sustain a conversation either. He'd be mid-sentence and then just trail off, staring at a spot on the wall as if looking through it. I decided I wanted as little interaction with this individual as possible. I informed him that I was exhausted and asked if I could simply get some sleep. He seemed almost relieved by the suggestion and gestured to the couch, indicating I could spend the night there. I asked if we could turn off the light, and he flicked off the lamp without argument. But he didn't leave. He just stood there in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, saying nothing, not even moving. I lay on the couch with my eyes half closed, trying to appear as though I were already drifting off. Eventually, after this long, uncomfortable pause, he finally retreated down the hallway toward what I presumed was his bedroom. I genuinely tried to sleep. I was exhausted, and the couch was actually more comfortable than I had anticipated. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I would begin to drift off and then jolt awake, convinced I had heard something. About an hour in, I actually did start hearing things. It took me a few seconds to realize that the thumping and scraping sounds were coming from above me. At first, I told myself it was just snow shifting on the roof. That happens all the time in heavy storms. But these sounds were different somehow. That didn't make any sense, though. The house was single-story. There was no upstairs floor for anyone to be walking around on. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, desperately trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The sounds continued for several minutes, sporadic but persistent. And then, without warning, there was a thump that was considerably louder than all the previous ones. It was so sudden and so forceful that I shot upright on the couch. And as soon as I sat up, I saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He must have been there for a while, just watching me in the dark, because I hadn't heard him return. My skin began to tingle. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could utter a word, he literally charged at me. He leaped over the back of the couch and tackled me to the floor. The next few seconds were pure chaos. We rolled around on the carpet, and I realized he was trying to put me in a chokehold. He was stronger than he looked, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to get him off. I kept resisting, and he started yelling. He screamed at me to stop fighting. He kept referencing her, as if I was supposed to understand what he was talking about. He said she was lonely, and mentioned something about how she would find me good company. I wasn't thinking about that, though. I was fighting for my life. I finally managed to get enough leverage to shove him off me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my coat, and ran for the front door. I didn't even put my coat on. I was too terrified to waste any more time. Behind me, I heard that crazy scream something. I'm pretty sure he said, "She's not going to be happy," or some insane along those lines. I ran and didn't stop until I reached the next house. The family who answered the door were normal people, a husband and wife by the looks of it. They took one look at me and pulled me inside without asking questions. I slept on their couch that night. The next morning, I woke up to the wife, who introduced herself as Kathy. She was making everyone coffee. The three of us sat at the kitchen table, and I told them what had happened. As soon as I described the house, the husband, whose name was Brandon, interrupted me. He asked if it was Joe. I said yes, and he just nodded as if he wasn't surprised at all. He told me that Joe had been a problem in the area for years, but then he told me something that gave my skin that itchy feeling again. About a decade earlier, Joe's wife had disappeared. There was never any official investigation. Nothing was ever proven, but most people in the area suspected he killed her. The body was never found. I immediately connected the dots, but kept my mouth shut for whatever reason. I still have no idea why I didn't speak up. I did end up reporting my experience to the police, but I don't think they ever did anything to address it. The scariest part is that I still live in the same house 3 years later. Nothing has happened since that night in the blizzard, but I'd be lying if I said I don't get a strange feeling every time I drive past Joe's house. The one positive outcome from all of this is that I grew close with the family who took me in that night. But I always get a peculiar sensation every time I visit them because it reminds me of Joe and whatever horrific act he committed against his wife. This incident occurred last winter during one of the worst blizzards I can recall. I'm 27 and live alone in a small rental house in upstate New York. I work remotely in finance, which sounds more glamorous than it is. Mostly, I just sit at my desk and stare at spreadsheets all day. The point is, I rarely have a reason to leave the house during the week. Some weeks I don't leave at all. Anyway, the local news had been hyping up this blizzard for days. You know how they get. Every storm is potentially historic or life-threatening until it dumps 3 inches, and everyone moves on. But this one actually looked serious. The weather alerts advised against non-essential travel and recommended stocking up on supplies. So that morning, I filled my pantry with enough groceries for the weekend, anticipating several uneventful days of remote work. By mid-afternoon, snow began to fall, and by 8 p.m., visibility extended barely beyond my front porch. I spent the majority of the evening reclined on my sofa, intermittently watching television and listening to the wind's persistent howl. The sound of a blizzard's wind is distinctly different from a summer storm's transient gusts. It's a constant, resonant drone, as if the house were enveloped in a tunnel. Around 10:30, a new noise cut through the din. A loud thud, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across wood. I speculated a tree branch had fallen. Given the old oak trees near my driveway and the heavy snow and wind, a snapped limb wouldn't have been surprising. About 15 minutes later, however, I heard a car horn. It wasn't a standard blast, but weak and sporadic, almost as if pressed accidentally. I approached my front window and peered outside. A vehicle was stationary near the end of my driveway. Its headlights pierced the snowfall, offering the only discernible detail. I waited a few minutes for any sign of movement, but none appeared. The intensity of the storm made it impossible to identify the car's make or model. My initial thought was that it had skidded off the road, a common occurrence in such conditions. While it might sound unsympathetic, I wasn't going to venture into a blizzard to assist a stranger, especially with visibility limited to 10 feet. I returned to the couch, attempting to redirect my attention. Around 11 o'clock, a knock echoed at my front door. I didn't open it. Instead, I called out, asking who was there. A man's voice replied, stating his car was stuck and he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice sounded strained, as if he were out of breath. A part of me felt a pang of guilt. If he had truly walked through that storm, he was likely freezing. Yet, another part remained hesitant to open my door to a stranger in the middle of the night. Rather than fully opening the door, I cracked it, ensuring the security chain remained latched. The man on my porch was strikingly covered in snow, comically so. It clung to his jacket, shoulders, and hair. He was shorter than me and visibly shivering. He explained his phone had died and he'd been walking for some time, searching for a lit house. I was about to unlatch the door when I noticed his boots. I'm unsure what prompted me to look down, but I did. And here's the crucial detail. His boots were clean, both spotless and dry. Had he genuinely been walking through a blizzard for any duration, his boots should have been encrusted with snow and ice, just like mine get from a short walk to my car. A cold dread, unrelated to the weather, settled in my stomach. I reiterated that I would call for help and ensure someone came for him. He repeated his request to be let in, this time more assertively. I didn't reply. I simply closed and locked the door. I heard him mumble something on the other side, but I was already heading for my phone. I dialed 911, explaining the situation. While speaking with the operator, I heard footsteps move from my porch, along the side of my house toward the back. The operator instructed me to remain inside and keep all doors locked. She informed me police were being dispatched, but cautioned that response times might be delayed due to the weather. I cautiously moved to a side window and peeked out, not wanting him to see me. The man stood near the corner of my house, perhaps 15 feet away. He was motionless, simply staring up at the windows. A few minutes later, intense banging erupted at my back door, as if someone was attempting to force entry. The entire door shuddered in its frame. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me and standing a few feet away. The banging ceased after about a minute. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Eventually, I heard the car horn again, the same as before, but this time it was one continuous, prolonged honk. Fortunately, the police arrived shortly thereafter. They located a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank, but it was further down the road than where I had initially seen headlights. Its engine was cold when they inspected it, not warm as it would have been had it been recently driven. Here's the detail that still unnerves me. The officers told me there were no footprints leading from the vehicle to my house. Apparently, the snow between the car and my property was undisturbed. There were footsteps leading down my driveway and around my house, but they ended at the driveway, as if someone had departed in a different car. The police searched the area but found no one. The next morning, after the storm had cleared and the sun was out, I ventured outside to investigate. To my horror, muddy handprints marred the exterior of my bedroom window, prints that definitely hadn't been there when the police searched the property. It was as if the person had returned after they left, or had been hiding and never left in the first place. A few days later, I learned that another house roughly half a mile away had been burglarized during the storm. The homeowner was absent at the time, so no one was harmed, but the peculiar aspect was that nothing was reported stolen. Whoever broke in took nothing. Why someone would break into a house during a blizzard and not even steal anything remains incomprehensible to me. It's almost as if the intruder wasn't aiming to rob the place, but to achieve something else entirely. I recognize this incident may not sound overtly terrifying, but I cannot shake the feeling that whoever was attempting to gain entry to my house, likely the same individual who broke into the other residence, harbored sinister intentions. I am profoundly relieved I did not open my door. This occurred several years ago. I've only shared this story with perhaps 3 people: my wife, my brother, and a close friend whom I trusted not to think I was irrational. I'm relating it here because I still lack an explanation, and at this point, I've accepted that I probably never will. I am 34 years old and reside in British Columbia. Throughout most of my 20s, I was a professional alpine skier, primarily competing in racing. I participated nationally for approximately 6 years until my body signaled it was time to cease. There was no dramatic, career-ending injury, just the cumulative wear and tear that inevitably occurs when you've been hurtling down mountains since childhood. I retired from competitive skiing at 26, a decision that felt and still feels correct. However, retiring from competitive skiing doesn't mean forsaking the sport entirely. If anything, it liberated me to pursue the type of skiing I truly loved: backcountry expeditions, far from resorts and crowds. I share this not to boast, but to establish my proficiency and experience in such environments. I was avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and intimately familiar with every protocol one should follow when solo skiing in remote terrain. I had undertaken dozens of backcountry solo trips without incident. My plan for that particular day was straightforward. I intended to visit a remote range a few hours north of my home, a location I had skied before. The weather forecast predicted light snowfall, perhaps a few inches, nothing that would hinder a day trip. I checked the avalanche conditions the night before and again that morning. Everything appeared manageable. I reached the mountain just after sunrise, strapped on my gear, and began ascending. The snowfall intensified during my climb, which wasn't unusual, but the wind had also shifted. It was blowing from a different direction than predicted, and was stronger than it should have been. Visibility also diminished much more rapidly than I found comfortable. The sensible course of action would have been to turn back immediately, but I had already reached the top of a line I had been anticipating all week. I told myself, just one run, then I would call it a day. I have replayed that decision 1,000 times since, and before anyone comments, yes, I acknowledge it was foolish. I am aware that experienced individuals frequently perish in the backcountry due to making precisely the kind of decision I made that day. I knew it even then, yet I proceeded anyway. The descent started uneventfully. The incline was manageable, and I skied cautiously, ensuring maximum safety. However, approximately 2/3 of the way down the mountain, the worst possible scenario occurred. If you've never experienced being caught in an avalanche, it's difficult to convey its suddenness. One moment you are in control, the next, you utterly aren't. It's not akin to wiping out or even catching an edge. The snow moves, and you have no option but to move with it. I was fortunate. The avalanche wasn't large, probably a Class 2, which was sufficient to knock me off my skis but not to bury me. I tumbled perhaps 30 or 40 yards before abruptly colliding with something solid. Slammed implies instantaneous deceleration. I don't even know what it was, likely rocks or perhaps a tree hidden beneath the snowpack. But all I recall in that moment was the sensation in my left leg. I remember lying there, attempting to convince myself everything was fine, but it wasn't. My skis had released, which was a good thing, their intended function. However, one of them had tumbled further downhill, and I had no idea of its whereabouts. I attempted to stand and immediately collapsed. The pain in my leg was indescribable. It's an experience I struggle to articulate. Having managed to get myself into a seated position, I began assessing my predicament. The snow seemed to be intensifying, signaling the likely onset of a blizzard. However, my leg was the most pressing concern. I couldn't bear much weight on it, meaning even if I found my other ski, I wouldn't be able to ski out. My options were starkly limited, presenting 3 choices, 2 of which were suicidal, and the third only marginally better. I could remain put, hoping someone would come looking for me, but only one person knew my whereabouts that day, and he wouldn't suspect trouble for several hours. Alternatively, I could attempt to dig a shelter and wait out the storm, but I lacked the necessary supplies for an overnight stay, and the temperature was plummeting. My final option was to begin a slow, painful descent, aiming to cover as much ground as possible before conditions worsened further. I opted to move. In truth, I had little other choice. Securing what remained of my equipment, I began a limping journey downhill, using the single ski pole that, by some miracle, was still in my hand as a makeshift crutch. Each step sent agonizing pain through my leg, but I knew I had to persist. As for the snow, my earlier prediction proved accurate. It only grew heavier, and soon it was falling so thickly that visibility became almost non-existent. I tried to ignore the throbbing in my leg, focusing on making as much progress as I could, all the while grappling with the terrifying thought of perishing out there, when I suddenly heard something behind me. Initially, I dismissed it as adrenaline finally overwhelming my senses, a symptom of delirium in my final moments before losing consciousness. Yet I turned around regardless, and what I witnessed confirmed my belief that I was hallucinating. Another skier was descending towards me. I cannot describe the profound emotion that surged through me upon seeing him emerge from the snow. It's a feeling for which there is no word. I was skeptical of the reality of what I was seeing, simultaneously relieved and terrified to find another person out there, and something more. It was fear, though I couldn't pinpoint its origin. He reached me within minutes. He was alone and, like me, equipped for backcountry skiing. He removed his helmet to adjust his goggles and inquired if I was injured. I recounted what had happened. Without a moment's hesitation, he moved to my side, allowing me to sling my arm around his shoulder. We began to move together. As I mentioned before, I experienced an unexplainable sensation, something beyond adrenaline, pain, relief, and confusion. It didn't feel like an ordinary encounter. It felt as though he hadn't stumbled upon me by chance, as outlandish as that sounds. We exchanged basic information, most of which I don't recall, but one particular statement he made lingered with me for some reason. He claimed he hadn't used his legs in a long time and found it pleasant to be back on solid ground. I didn't fully grasp his meaning, assuming it was some skiing jargon I was unfamiliar with. I chuckled and we continued our descent. At one point, I had to stop. I remember this precise moment as if it were yesterday. I leaned against a tree and closed my eyes for a mere 4 seconds. When I reopened them, he was gone. There was no one there. Yet, unless he had buried himself in the snow, there was nowhere for anyone to have simply vanished. I called out for him. What else could I do? But there was no reply. I began scouring the immediate area of snow, thinking perhaps he had become buried. Nothing. Worse still, there were no tracks in the snow other than my own. A wave of panic washed over me. He had been right there beside me, supporting half my weight for what must have been an hour, and now there was no trace. Dizziness enveloped me, like a punch to the gut. The inexplicable sensation I had felt earlier returned. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Could I have been more disoriented than I realized? Perhaps the snow had covered his tracks faster than mine. Or maybe I had hallucinated the entire event. Perhaps I was already dead. I had no time to unravel it. The storm would not abate for me to process what had happened. I don't know how I made it back to my car. The final mile or so is a blur of pain, cold, and a stubborn refusal to cease moving. But I did eventually reach it. I drove myself to the hospital and, at last, received some good news. The doctor informed me that my leg was severely sprained, not broken. They assured me I was incredibly fortunate. Fast forward a few days, and I'm still recuperating at home. But one thought incessantly occupies my mind. That other skier. Where he came from, where he went, why there were no tracks. I kept telling myself I'd figure it out eventually, though I suspected it was mostly wishful thinking. While browsing a local skier-centric website, something I often do, I stumbled upon something terrifying. It was a story about a fatal backcountry skiing incident. A man who had been lost in a storm a few weeks prior. It had occurred on the same mountain range, and authorities had been unable to locate a body. The worst had been assumed. There were no photographs of the man in the article, and when I searched his name, I found no Facebook or Instagram profiles or anything of that nature. Therefore, I cannot compare the man I saw on the mountain to the man